Intersectional feminism is communist particle board. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and if you know anything about the history of feminism, you might have asked yourself, how did feminism go from the white feather campaign of the first wave, when women would give young men who weren't in uniform white feathers to shame them for avoiding going to war, all the way to the current year, where feminists almost shame women for not being interested in pursuing engineering at university? How exactly did feminists go from demanding the right for women to vote, all the way up to believing it was acceptable to mandate that every boardroom in California was composed partially of female directors, as if the state should have complete control in all matters? You've likely heard people say things like, well, leftists and feminists are all just a bunch of commies, in spite of the fact that communists mainly cared about economics and intersectionals care almost exclusively about identity politics. Though, not surprisingly, the truth is that when people call intersectional feminists communists, they aren't exactly wrong. And thus, my goal here is to prove it by connecting point A to point B to point C. Now, I'm largely going to rely on 3 historical communist female examples to illustrate this point, but I could certainly talk about others. So let's start with point A. What does Mary Inman, author of In Women's Defense, have in common with Suzanne Weiss of Everyday Feminism and literally every feminist that's ever written about quote-unquote emotional labor? What did Susan B. Anthony have in common with her granddaughter, Susan B. Anthony II? What were their differences? And how and why did Susan B. Anthony II end up marching together with people like Billie Jean King during the women's liberation movement in 1978? Shown here. Why are completely wacky, identity politic obsessed, and politically incompetent people like Nikita Oliver, who once came close to becoming the mayor of Seattle, put on a pedestal by thousands or maybe even millions of people who simply identify as being leftists simply because of their identities? Not unlike Claudia Jones, who they wrote an entire book about called Left of Karl Marx. You see, something used to exist in decent numbers. It was the United States Communist Party, which had about 60,000 people in it by the end of World War II. And then, at some point during mid-last century, the Communist Party of the United States largely went underground, or people resigned, due to both the McCarthy era and the Cold War, thus prompting the Communist Party to splinter into bits, though it all but came back together towards the end of last century, and this time, it's maybe even bigger, and ran mainly by women. Granted, it's a bit of a long story, and properly doing the research is completely tedious, and I don't wish it on any of you, which is why I'm making this video, and why I will be very precise about history, though I first need to make it clear where the backbone of my research came from. Over the course of researching this video, I read all sorts of stuff, including an entire book written by an intersectional feminist with endless articles and videos to go along with my research, which I've been doing for years, as well as an entire book written by an anti-feminist with endless articles and videos that I've also been looking at for years. However, the 2 things that ended up being most useful were this: a book called Red Feminism by a feminist leftist named Kate Weigand, and the work of David Horowitz, who is a conservative scholar that used to be a full-blown Marxist himself that actually did work with the Black Panthers. The first book is about why the author believes that contemporary feminism was built on the sentiments of communist women during and prior to the Cold War. Funnily enough, at the beginning of her book, she said something to the effect of, Many conservatives have long disparagingly compared the feminist movement to communism. However, in this book, I'll explain why they're kind of right. David Horowitz's work has also been completely instrumental in helping me understand the contemporary left in terms of its high-level political motivations, funding, and their habits of hiding in the shadows, rebranding themselves to sound less like communists, prioritizing the Islamic identity as the pinnacle of the oppressed, and using terms like social justice and another world is possible to sugarcoat their deep hatred of liberal democracies. That being said, I figured that after reading books written by far leftists themselves, and a recovering far leftist like the ridiculously well-researched, cited, and experienced David Horowitz, I had a balanced perspective, and since both people admitted to a lot of the same exact information in their books, each citing endless footnotes, I feel confident that I'm almost certainly not missing something important. So, okay, what is intersectional feminism and what is communism? Let's start there. Well, I'd best describe communism as the utopian end goal of a civilization that Karl Marx imagined we'd be naturally living in once capitalism inevitably collapsed and the workers owned the means of production, thus promoting the notion that everybody should only work according to their needs in proportion to their abilities. The idea was basically that capitalism wasn't sustainable and would collapse naturally, and Marx merely predicted how this would happen, which ended up not being true, as capitalist societies fare the best in the world to this day, and thus, due to this major miscalculation, Marx thought something along the lines of believing that the meek shall inherit the earth from the greedy rich capitalists, and then eventually we wouldn't need a government because people would feel inclined to cooperate and stuff. And since there was that major miscalculation, a lot of people tried to force the world into Marx's vision, and a lot of people died. Granted, Marx wrote a lot, but he was apparently mainly just criticizing capitalism, which later became described as communist theory, which is basically an elaborate way for weak-minded people to justify whining about the real world. And since the communist end goal is literally impossible, as it defies human nature, communist theory is all we're ever going to get. That's my abridged definition of communism. That said, the people who take these supposed theories seriously, which technically weren't theories at all, as it was really just a debunked hypothesis about a future one-world, non-governmental, utopian civilization that we'd end up living in inevitably or whatever, these people who take Marx's writings seriously have created all sorts of political parties since around the turn of last century, hoping to get to that one-world non-government, even though intelligent people with economic knowledge know it's all BS. Otherwise stated for the purposes of this video, communism is just an international political ideology and party for complainers that have gotten really good at hiding their beliefs and practices through trial and error due to the fact that there's been wars between communist-ish governments and other governments, and these communists often disguise themselves with subtle word choices like pretending there's a huge difference between socialism and communism, when very often these people are entirely one and the same.
Your planet was on the brink of collapse. I'm the one who stopped that. Do you know what's happened since then? The children born have known nothing but full bellies and clear skies. It's a paradise.
Because you murdered half the planet.
A small price to pay for salvation.
You're insane.
The best way to simply define intersectional feminism would be a political ideology based around far leftist identity politics, which developed as a result of decades of prioritizing the disadvantages of one or two or three groups, maybe even more, then combining those disadvantages with those of other groups and seeing how they overlap, but making sure it's all built around demonizing white males and their societal contributions as capitalistic and oppressive. Otherwise stated, intersectional feminism is a simple formula that attempts to calculate people's hardships in life with a game of basic arithmetic, which places particular emphasis on certain immutable traits while never even vaguely attempting to amend the formula in any way, shape, or form to include other different immutable traits in different circumstances, as it assumes that in literally every context available, people are disadvantaged or advantaged due to their immutable traits that somebody can then plug into a formula because life's hardships are as simple as algebra, fam.
2 plus 2 is 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. I can see why this is so popular.
Truthfully, from my standpoint as a men's rights advocate, the absolute most important thing to keep in mind about intersectional feminism is that it's not even proper intersectionality by any stretch of the imagination. At least if you were to look at the philosophical concept of intersectionality being the study of various different overlapping hardships and disadvantages and how they affect you in society. Yep. Intersectionality isn't even the least bit honestly intersectional, and the reason for that is fairly simple. The modern communist movement and the modern feminist movement are literally one and the same. So the intersectional feminists claim to be intersectional, but they'll never admit that men simply have it worse than females in contemporary Western nations by every tangible systemic metric available, because in order to do that, you'd have to violate both feminist principles and Marxist principles. But now I have to go back to the beginning because you're probably confused. You see, every intersectional feminist theorist like bell hooks and propagandists like ContraPoints exclusively cite Marx as an influence. But from everything I have gathered, while Marx would probably have said that women were oppressed by capitalism, and maybe even might have said that women are more oppressed than men, I have never found a single shred of evidence to indicate that Marx felt that women have it worse than men. Actually, it might have been the reverse, being that he was apparently rather obsessed with the conditions of factory workers, who were mostly male, and thus he might very well have believed the opposite that intersectional feminists do when it comes to gender oppression. I mean, if somebody can correct me, I'd love to know about it, but if you examine history, it's somewhat possible that Karl Marx was maybe a bit less of a feminist and more of an MRA.
Are you kidding me?
But don't worry, there's a very tangible reason why Marxists are all feminists. While Karl Marx might not have been much of a feminist at all, he had this friend named Friedrich Engels, and therein lies the feminist seed. Engels came from a wealthy family, co-authored books with Marx that Marx probably wrote the dramatic majority of, and then lived with Marx for a number of years as his patron. Thus, when Marx died, a year later, Engels published a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, in which Engels argues that state-sanctioned marriage and family structures are an oppressive setup to take away the freedoms of women almost as if they are slaves to the husbands, and this book, despite being published a year after Marx's death, became the absolute foundation of how Marxist-identified people thought about sex, gender, and relationships, even though it might have been a book Marx would have totally hated. Eventually, after Engels altered what people thought of as quote-unquote Marxism into being something somewhat about gender that Marx might not have approved of, it must have been far easier to get women on board with communist political parties in every nation that these parties existed in. That book probably helped a lot to ensure that in every nation that had a successful Marxist revolution, there were always endless, obedient, brainwashed female communists within it. However, there were several nations that had less successful communist parties, and one of those is my nation, the United States, whose Communist Party was founded almost exactly 100 years ago in May of 1919, after a rift from the Socialist Party, implying more than heavily that there were already all sorts of Marxists in the United States by the time our Communist Party even formed.
Is that your idea of revolution? I'd like to hear more about your revolutionary concept, Louis.
My idea of revolution is not a revolution in my own party.
Oh, no.
And my idea of a socialist party is not a debate in society. It is a party of action.
Fine. The example we can give him is go to that convention and take control of the party.
No, we form our own party, and I hope that everybody here who believes in Bolshevism will be there that night to help found that party.
Now keep in mind, it should definitely be of note that the end goal of communism involves an entire world that has abolished trading with currencies, aka capitalism, and then randomly getting along with each other and sharing the means of production while fairly distributing productivity among the population. That meant that formational communist parties throughout the entire world had strong tendencies to try to get along. Not that it always worked. But this meant that they were always sniffing for new recruits no matter what race or background they were. That all being said, a lot of people make two historical claims when they think about the early years of the United States Communist Party, which leftists now call the Old Left, which encompassed the time period from around the formation of our Communist Party in 1919 until the end of World War II, when the Cold War with the Stalinist Soviet Union became the biggest global militaristic priority in our nation, and thus the Communist Party people generally went underground or denounced the Communist Party. The two claims I've heard people make repeatedly are first, that the United States Communist Party was entirely being controlled by KGB operatives, which is definitely not entirely untrue, but seemingly a bit of an oversimplification, and might be applying a bit too much importance to the Soviets, due to the fact that there were American Marxists that had their own ideas about how the communist utopia should work. You see, the author of Red Feminism described the Old Left as being years of great political turmoil between domestic communists, as they all had their own specific set of grievances, and social limitations around being able to work effectively with each other, and that included American communists being able to work efficiently with Russian communists living in the United States, i.e., they fought a lot. Even back then, identity politics and what I call starving piranha syndrome caused a fair amount of tension as, for example, the white domestic communists were often racist towards the black communists, and black people involved with the organization obviously didn't appreciate that, so many domestic communists made it a big point to fight against what they called black chauvinism, because they felt that racism would keep black people away from the Communist Party, which, remember, was something that they thought everybody on Earth should be a part of.
We accept a one of us.
Gooba gobble, gooba gobble.
We accept her, we accept her. Google gobble, Google gobble. One of us. One of us. Google gobble.
The United States Communist Party did lots of targeted outreach towards the black community in particular, which was sometimes based around legitimately helping black people, or Negroes as they would have called them, with issues that were legitimately affecting the black community. But the caveat was that if they worked with any black community organizers and helped them get anything done, they expected the community organizer to prioritize the Communist Party ahead of their own communities, which I think is pretty messed up. That said, there were all sorts of problems between the Russian Bolshevik communist immigrants, who didn't always mix super well with the white domestic communists, because let's be honest, when you get a bunch of people who hate capitalism because they feel that it didn't work for them, the starving piranha syndrome will always rear its ugly head. But one thing is true. While not all of the Bolsheviks necessarily had ties with the KGB, there were historically noted KGB operatives among the Communist Party in the United States, and when they were arrested at the beginning of the Cold War, it crippled the leadership within the Communist Party severely, which certainly didn't help morale, and became one of the turning points that marked the end of the old left era, as the other communists were generally forced to go underground to escape persecution. The next subject that I should cover and or partially debunk is the idea that all of this identity politics stuff originated from the scholars known as the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxism, who ended up teaching at Columbia University eventually, which is simply mostly untrue, as the actual school part of it was founded in Germany 4 years after there was already a communist party within the United States, and there is really nothing super significant within the Frankfurt School that wouldn't have probably naturally emerged in a country like the United States in terms of identity politics due to the melting pot nature of our nation. Yes, the Frankfurt School did have a fairly significant influence in helping get Marxist ideals into academic institutions, with their key role in postmodern philosophy, but it certainly didn't invent Marxist identity politics like so many people seem to claim. It was merely one of the staples of postmodernism, which metaphorically would be like the glue that holds the particle board together. If there's glue in particle board. I think there's glue? I mean, let's just be logical about this. Sure, there might have been a lot of particular emphasis on applying social dynamics to Marxist and socialist principles within the Frankfurt School, but Engels was already talking about that crap regarding husbands and wives right after Marx died. And if you were in the United States starting in 1919 and joined the Communist Party and were already viewing the world through the lens of the oppressed and the oppressors, you wouldn't need any theories from some guys that had just moved from Europe for it to occur to you that black people have separate and distinct issues when you compare them to white people. That being said, I don't want to get into postmodernism excessively in this video, because those are long concepts that I have talked about a bit in other videos, and people like Jordan Peterson and a man named Stephen Hicks especially specialize in explaining postmodernist thought, which originated mainly in academia, and these people have both delivered great lectures about postmodernism, like this one.
But the other option then is to say, you know, I'm going to believe what I want to believe. There's no way I can give up this beautiful, deep part of my identity. And that means that I have to find some way to get rid of the logic, the evidence, and the commitment to reason. That I'm going to elevate a subjective commitment to something I want to be true over reason. And we do know in the history then of religion that there are many religious strategists who take that route. Limit reason, crucify reason, set aside reason in order to rejuvenate personal faith commitments. Now that exact same psychology carries over to politics. And that's the claim I'm making here about the 1950s socialists. The smart ones recognized that the arguments for socialism had been destroyed. Mises, Hayek, and the others, and all of the empirical data, right, that was out there. There's no way to give a rational explication for the economic superiority of socialism, right, over capitalism. And the data shows that the socialist nations have been brutal in practice.
Truthfully, what I think really happened to create the form of identity politics that is now titled as intersectional feminism is a bit more like a Darwinian evolution of throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck in terms of domestic communists whining a whole lot in a number of ways all up until the Cold War, and trying to push the Communist Party onto the masses, but ultimately being somewhat directionless as they only had 60,000 members by the end of World War II, which is kind of a lot, but in comparison to places like Eastern Europe, extremely few. Out of all of the scrappiest of the people doing the communist infighting, one of the most dedicated and resilient was a woman named Mary Inman, who wrote a book called In Woman's Defense. She's very hard to find photographs of on the internet, so I'm not going to show one because I just couldn't find one, due to the fact that she was basically the original women's issues author that wrote from the communist perspective in the United States, or as they generally referred to themselves, even before the Cold War, the progressive perspective. Yes, the word progressive has been a communist dog whistle since before World War II. Mary Inman was a very troubled person who felt that she was put in a place where she had to look after her older brothers and father due to circumstances that aren't entirely clear, and because of this, she developed a body of work based around the difficulties that housewives and women face behind the scenes that were almost entirely ignored by male members of the Communist Party. While male communists generally claimed that they wanted women to be equal to men, they didn't want to face the reality that some women really do things that men almost never do, like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. Thus, Mary Inman made it her life's work to inform the United States Communist Party of these things with this book, and it ended up getting around. All over the United States Communist Party, they ended up reading this book. And completely non-surprisingly, she relied very heavily on the work of Frederick Engels, and in particular the book The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, to make her case. Personally, I don't think that what she was saying about women's work being largely ignored is entirely untrue, but it caused a lot of controversy within the party, which was aggravated by her aggressive and downright paranoid behavior. Though the party didn't dissociate with her immediately, and she made some allies while getting more and more women to read and recommend her book In Women's Defense to other members of the Communist Party. One of those women she made an alliance with was named Susan B. Anthony II, who Inman immediately found remarkable because she shared her grandmother's name, and it turned out that the apple didn't fall entirely far away from the tree, for while the original Susan B. Anthony was a classical feminist, most related to the original definition coined by a French male socialist, who claimed that a society should be judged by how well it treats its women, both women were obsessed with women getting what they want out of society and government. Or, in other words, Mary Inman was the most female prioritizing woman within the equality-obsessed Communist Party, and while Susan B. Anthony II wanted equality for everybody, she had a soft spot for women because that ran in her family as the kin of the original Susan B. Anthony.
This is boring.
You're boring.
Yeah, sorry. But the point is that Susan B. Anthony II was a historically ignored communist, but also kind of a bit of a feminist at the same time, due to her lineage and her relationship with Mary Inman back even before the end of World War II, back when feminists and communists didn't get along. Together with a few more women, they started an organization called the Council for American Women, or CAW in short, which served to be pivotal in the way that the domestic Communist Party dealt with gender grievances. And while Mary Inman fell out from the Communist Party on very bad terms by the end of 1941, and eventually became convinced that the party had an organized conspiracy to destroy her reputation and rewrite history so that she wasn't included in it, which led to her no longer talking to people like Susan B. Anthony II eventually, and refusing to do interviews as if she was likely mentally ill, women like Anthony and all of their friends made sure to have everybody they knew read Mary Inman's book, In Women's Defense. Thus, knowing that Susan B. Anthony II her very self was marching arm in arm during the second wave feminist women's liberation movement of the 1960s, 1970s or so, with all sorts of young women, including such people as Billie Jean King, it should come as no surprise that the feminists of the 1960s and 1970s were reading the crap out of this original proto-Marxist feminist book in women's defense. Because according to my research, seemingly every scholar on the left that cares about female issues, which is seemingly all of them, has read it for well over 50 years. And thus, it should be of no surprise that they talk about things like emotional labor so readily now, because that book was essentially the template for valuing female-centric contributions to things that females might not have been directly involved in all of the time.
If I got paid for all of my emotional labor, I'd have like a lot of money. I would get 100 different wigs made out of exotic horsehair to match all of my moods. I'd replace all my teeth with tiny iPhones. I'd pay all of the tall people and people making out at shows to stand in the back because I'm bitter.
Okay, dear, I think you owe me a few bucks for having to watch that 30-second clip. And honestly, if you read anything about Mary Inman, who essentially coined this concept, she probably would think that woman is an entitled, whiny brat, right before Mary would have said, "No interviews." Next, let's dig a bit into the mind of Claudia Jones, who I like to think of as the first true saint of intersectional feminism, who was a black woman that joined the youth division of the Communist Party in the 1930s and ended up basing a huge portion of her talking points and organizing based around the notion that she was triply oppressed as a poor black woman, which was apparently very marketable as she became popular within the Communist Party and climbed the ranks successfully. Claudia Jones didn't just feel as if she was triply oppressed, but she actively told older white progressives that they shouldn't view black women as inexperienced, fresh recruits, but rather as individuals that should essentially be assumed to be good leaders because of the fact that they are triply oppressed, and thus the older white communists should, theoretically, according to her, promote them into leadership positions seemingly because reasons. Which I'm sure couldn't have possibly been the least bit self-serving as a way to climb the ranks herself. It's almost as if Claudia Jones invented affirmative action.
My goodness, I thought we've held that the 14th Amendment protects all races. I mean, that was the argument in the early years, that it protected only the blacks. But I thought we rejected that. You say now that we have to proceed as though its purpose is not to protect whites, not only to protect minorities.
I think it is. It's a measure that's an anti-discrimination measure,
right?
And it's a measure in which the question of discrimination is determined not just by power, by who has privilege in the society, and those minorities that are oppressed, be they religious or racial, need protection from a more privileged majority.
And unless that exists, the 14th Amendment is not violated. Is that right? So if you have a banding together of various minority groups who discriminate against whites, that's okay?
I think that...
Do you have any case of ours that propounds that view of the 14th Amendment, that it protects only minorities? Any case?
No case of yours.
Regardless, while Claudia Jones was able to cash in on oppression points even back in the 30s through 50s, she took things a bit too far and accused the communist progressives of neglecting black women completely, which was simply untrue. And while she did a few other things that earned her a reputation as somebody who was a rather off-putting, disagreeable, and hard to work with individual, the fact remained. By no later than 1948, Due largely to Claudia Jones's influence, the domestic Communist Party was already all intersectional and woke about women of color. And of course, you can bet she knew Susan B. Anthony II because the organizers of the United States Communist Party all knew each other anyway. Truthfully, I learned more by reading this book than I'll probably ever really remember, including things that legitimately surprised me, such as the fact that due to the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, which banned propaganda in the United States, there were people who were literally arrested and had their lives essentially ruined for being mere actors in the one full-blown communist propaganda film that wasn't trying to slyly hide what it actually was. Salt of the Earth, which, due to my principles as a free speech advocate, I believe was excessive, in that if mere actors are getting arrested, even during a Cold War, they'll become martyrs, which is counterproductive to fighting their bad ideas. Another thing that I learned was that women became dramatically more powerful within the United States Communist Party, even just right at the end of World War II. For the brief period when it was still safe to openly organize as domestic communists, due to these women feeling like they had been doing all of the organizing work for the Communist Party, and then their husbands came home from fighting Stalin's icky enemy, and they didn't want to go back to the kitchen. I also learned that the seeds of call-out culture were right in the culture of communist women all throughout the old left, as instead of actually producing a whole bunch of artistic material themselves, they largely just sat around writing letters to the editors, complaining about messages of male supremacy in advertising or whatever the hell else that sounds basically the same as they sound today. Though they did publish poetry about how awful rape is and fiction depicting positive representations of women or something like that I'm sure nobody really read.
If your husband ever finds out about not storing the freshest coffee, you's gonna get a spanking.
Let a man flip me over like this, unless it's in the bedroom, I don't think so. This is an advertisement for coffee?
This looks like an ad for 50 Shades of Grey.
Furthermore, I learned that Sigmund Freud's psychological work was already demonized by the women of the Communist Party by no later than 1948, when communist women attacked his entire body of work as being a part of some sort of problematic individualist worldview, which was inherently male supremacist, because I guess males are particularly good at being individualistic or something.
What the actual fuck?
However, maybe what I found most interesting was the fact that the communist women and the old school feminists from the first wave and after, prior to the second wave of feminism, which is when it became inseparably Marxist, didn't get along well with each other, as the first wave feminists had no great collectivist, utopian vision in mind for the entire planet, and communist women did. Even further than that, the first wave feminists didn't have much of a problem being openly racist towards black men, though it should definitely be of note that all feminists are inherently racist people because they refuse to acknowledge that life for racial minorities that happen to be male are generally dramatically worse than life for racial minorities that are female. But of course, the thing about the United States Communist Party is that it largely ended on paper during the Cold War, largely due to people like Senator Joseph McCarthy, but that happened because, duh, there really were legitimate KGB operatives trying to undermine our democracy. There literally was all sorts of communist propaganda being passed around, and so, when people started being arrested, they couldn't be honest about their political ideas and motives any longer. However, such people absolutely did not give up on their communist beliefs, and instead, they quietly taught communism all through the 1950s and 1960s, either to their children, which we now call red diaper babies, and they congregate in activist organizations, mainly centered around anti-war activism, black civil rights issues, and of course, the women's liberation movement, which was the first to establish academic legitimacy in universities by no later than when the first women's studies department was founded in 1970 in San Diego. You see, there was even a university called the Jefferson School of Social Sciences, which itself is Marxist in New York City, but it closed its doors in 1956, which is actually rather late for an entire Marxist higher education institution, and thus you really have to wonder just how many communist educators there were, and always were.
Now I realize that the minute anyone tries to get a communist out of a college, out of a university, there will be raised the phony cry that you're interfering with academic freedom. I would like to emphasize that there is no academic freedom where a communist is concerned.
Of course, when the communists of the 1950s and 1960s were raising red diaper babies on the down low, they had all sorts of dog whistles to signify to each other what their political beliefs actually were. For one small example, when people that were in favor of liberal democracies began persecuting communists, and they were called anti-communists, the communists proclaimed themselves to be anti-communists, and obviously progressives, according to David Horowitz, who was a red diaper baby himself.
I don't think my mother ever got a traffic ticket. They were very middle class, not break the law. But they did hide an East German communist in the basement who the government wanted to deport.
How did he get to your basement?
I have no idea. I was very young.
Did you know there was someone down there? I mean, did you know something was going on?
Dieter was his name. I forgot the last name. His brother was the mayor of East Berlin.
Okay.
Yeah, they were very conspiratorial. They never referred to themselves as communists, only as progressives.
Somehow, being an anti-communist was considered okay in our democracy during the formational years of the New Left, as a huge portion of people who actively identified as being part of the New Left were also anti-communists, and people didn't really think it was all that weird. Now, did these people hide the fact that they were communists? Well, maybe some of them didn't entirely know that they were communists, and I guess others probably did hide the fact that they were communists. Kinda, sorta, barely. Unless they didn't at all, such as people like Angela Davis, who is another saint-like figure to the intersectional feminists of today, who was known to have done direct work with the Communist Party. You see, the people from the New Left knew that they were supposed to say that they weren't communists, because even after the McCarthy era died out and people wouldn't necessarily get arrested for acting in a movie that turned out to be communist propaganda, these people at least had to deal with the embarrassment of Stalin and Red China. But oddly, they found a way to at least pretend to keep the dream alive. The New Left, neo-Marxist type people did this by trying to make postmodernism make sense and eclipse all other schools of thought. Briefly stated, postmodernism is the idea that objective reality is entirely defined by the context of who the most powerful classes are at any given time, because allegedly the ruling class always defines what we consider objective reality, which therefore makes objective reality subjective and gives people that you can define as being less powerful in whatever way that you want permission to break, bend, or change the rules, at least if you are a Marxist. Granted, postmodernism doesn't make much of any sense in most contexts, even without Marxism, and I legitimately don't believe that the majority of people who claim to think that it does actually believe what they claim to believe, as instead, I think they largely don't really know what they think, because I was honestly a bit like that myself after being gaslit my entire life in a far leftist, feminist environment, like Seattle in the 1980s and 1990s. More potently, there is a very well-circulated postmodernist named Paulo Freire, who wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in which he argues that history is passed down through educational institutions, top down from the oppressors, which, according to him, is an oppressive system of passing down information which might not always be helpful or valid, and thus, students, and especially oppressed students, which he never clearly defines, should constantly be teaching their teachers and educational faculty all of the profound lessons of the oppressed to help them educate each other, and this book is taught all over the world and undoubtedly had a direct influence in things like the Evergreen College protests of 2017.
I have claustrophobia.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we do too! Blocking America!
And we endure hate crimes on your campus and we pay to be here.
That students of color have to work in threatening environments every day.
Come on, baby.
Welcome. Get to work.
You can get that work. We need.
That being said, the New Left, which, remember, by the early 1960s, was composed, basically unanimously, of postmodern Marxist weirdos who literally want to deny reality in favor of nihilistically demonizing capitalism, never had much of any sincere game plan. Being that they know that they tried communism several times in different places, but it always ended badly for everybody. So, for the latter part of last century, these people basically must have sat around having political beliefs based around complaining and actively not making any sense, as if that was part of the fun. Let's just complain about capitalism. And don't worry about having an alternative or making any sense. That's for modernists, and we are postmodernists. It probably didn't look dissimilar to this.
So the masculinist alt-right analysis of society is exactly upside down. Guys, you are not under the thumb of a Jewish feminist plot to turn you into girly soy boy cucks. Cultural Marxism did not turn you into placid IKEA consumers. Capitalism did. So what you need to do is stop scapegoating non-whites, feminists, and trans people and unite with the rest of us to actually do something about the real enemy, the blood-sucking, goddamn reptiles.
By the 1960s and 1970s, these types of people were generally splintered off into various different Marxist or Marxist-ish anti-war and civil rights organizations, and they'd largely dog whistle to each other about their true nature while putting on an innocent face to get donations from wealthy people, which is why slogans such as "each according to their needs, each according to their abilities" were replaced by slogans like social justice and more benign-sounding slogans like another world is possible. Now granted, these organizations certainly never went away, and a few scholars like Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn worked with the history is a weapon of the oppressors mentality to literally start selectively editing history to dishonestly make the United States, white men, and capitalism at large sound as awful as possible to anybody they could get to uncritically read a people's history of the United States, and hopefully listen to Rage Against the Machine or whatever. However, for the most part, these people had very small operations and didn't cross over a whole bunch into mainstream culture because it simply wasn't super fashionable outside of cities like Seattle, Berkeley, Olympia, Washington, Eugene, Oregon, Chicago, and maybe some places in Brooklyn and Portland. I don't know, I'm probably missing a few places. But then, unfortunately, a few things happened to revive new energy into the communist spirit, which was first the protests against the 1999 World Trade Organization, which was just a huge rallying cry for far leftist activists of all types who wanted to be a part of something, anything, that vaguely looked like the Vietnam War protests or whatever. And then, of course, after that activist spirit was already rekindled in 1999, soon after 9/11 happened. And all of those veritably dormant groups combined with the new energy of a real anti-war protest led to a gigantic swath of anti-war far leftist quasi-Marxists. And all of a sudden, there was money to be made if you were a slyly communist professional activist, due to the fact that the Democrats realized that coming down hard against the Iraq war would be the easiest ticket back into the White House. So the DNC threw lots of money at these people. Finally, Obama ran for president, and it all came to a head, as it turned out that the first black president was also somebody with a firm history of being educated by Marxists, as well as direct experience working in Marxist organizing with the now defunct project called Acorn.
This is why I say Barack Obama is a communist. He was raised by communists. His whole political career until he became a United States senator was in the communist left. I mean, I know these people. If you are part of a movement that you know is evil, the first thing you want to do is warn other people about it, especially when it's so deceptive. It talks about social justice and all this crap.
Really, the fact that we voted for Obama was basically a Marxist-ish act by itself. Certainly in the vein of the United States communists, in that we mainly really voted for him because he was a black guy who believed in free-ish healthcare that was with the party that was allegedly less war hawkish, which proved that the people of our nation fundamentally believed that the oppressed should be leaders, like Claudia Jones had said in the 1940s. However, a few strange things happened somewhere along the way that most people didn't see coming until it was a bit too late for comfort, which was that the far leftists in the United States started making alliances with Islamic governments and wealthy Islamists, so that current United States communists could use their skills as lawyers to defend the free speech rights of domestic radicals, terrorists, or people who fund Islamic jihadi terrorists. You see, by the late 1980s, there were groups of radical Islamists in the Mideast that began marketing their organizations as the victims of Western oppression, claiming something along the lines of, "The white capitalists stole all of our oil," and thus they shook hands with Western communist organizations and Marxist leaders at conferences such as the one held in Durban, South Africa, which was titled as something to fight against racism, but was really a way for Islamic leaders and Marxist leaders to coordinate an assault on liberal democracies such as the United States, the UK, and Israel. Now, being that we do know for sure that Qatar funds news sites like Al Jazeera, which makes Facebook propaganda videos like AJ+, it's not all that difficult to assume that the Islamic governments or their wealthy citizens were sending checks maybe directly to local far leftist activists, which is why Islamic people are treated as even more oppressed than black people, because the Islamists are financing all of it. And we learned that Islamic people are supposed to be more oppressed than black people by no later than when one of intersectional feminists' collective favorite rappers, Azealia Banks, got in a whole lot of trouble with intersectional media after insulting Zayn Malik about his ethnic heritage. being that he's from Pakistan, which is a Muslim-majority nation.
But Azealia Banks took to Twitter yesterday and showed her ass once again. Yesterday, she slung shit at a 14-year-old girl that's been on everyone's dash lately, Sky Jackson. In her rant, she made several references to the sexual favors that her mother performed to get her to where she is today, and most notably told her that she's gonna have to get some plastic surgery to fix her lack of hips and ass. On top of all that, she also called Zayn Malik a very typical racial slur that's thrown at Middle Eastern people that just so happens to include a slur that's thrown at black people.
Kat Black was one of the biggest intersectional feminist YouTubers, and while granted, I'm fairly sure she was just a useful idiot who doesn't understand politics, what she and other fourth-wave feminists, which had a sizable public platform, all shared in common was that they utilized the internet to spread social justice and progressive values. And this was obviously very useful for an international movement that allied itself with Islamic governments, of course. You see, here's the thing. The fact of the matter is that the Communist Party of the United States never really went away. Intersectional feminism really is just communism with a female head, as if a head grew back in the old one's place after the previous head was chopped off when people didn't want to worship Stalin or Mao past the 1950s, and women's studies departments were a great Trojan horse to get their way into academia. Now, the way that intersectional feminists view all sorts of things are often completely contradictory. Why is it that communists pretend to be such anti-war activists? Well, because they want to stop the United States from interfering in bloody communist revolutions, obviously. Unless, of course, Noam Chomsky wants the United States to stay in the Middle East because it suits his wacky and inconsistent agenda, or maybe the agenda of some of his allies or something. Why are feminist communists also defending the hell out of Islam, even though it is so oppressive to women? Because, well, Islamic governments are paying them, we can assume. Think of Islam as the funding that pays for the electricity which operates the machine that builds the particle board. Why is it that communists are obsessed with black Americans and place them on an infantile pedestal as if they are only capable of failing or succeeding as citizens with the help of white people? Well, that's probably because black communists were essentially saying just that as far back as the 1940s. Thanks, Claudia Jones. You really did the black demographic well by demanding promotions due to your immutable traits. So why is it that communists are all feminists now? I ask again. Well, that's because Frederick Engels wrote the book on feminism, and being that the United States never had a full-scale communist revolution to show these entitled, self-important, delusional women just how bad it can get when you try it, they decided that if a woman of color was in charge of it all, it would have all been okay. So when you keep all of that in mind, is it any surprise when you see people like Nikita Oliver running for mayor in the super far leftist and feminist city of Seattle talking about things like this?
Do you see the boy in the corner? Yeah. The one with the prettiest blue eyes. Do you see how he carries well-intentioned honesty like a badge, how entitlement wears his shoulders like a mantle, and privilege, well, privilege holds his hands? Do you see how he speaks to the class like royalty, looks at me like target practice, fires off Nikita? I'm just being honest. But when you say Black Lives Matter, I feel like you're calling me racist. I feel like he trails off.
Or talking about things like this.
The communities that need it most, which is part of what prompted why we decided, and I say we because it wasn't a decision I made on my own, and it wasn't an act I did on my own, why we decided to run a candidate for mayor who represented the interests of the most marginalized, most vulnerable, to start changing that, as opposed to just talking about it or complaining about it, which liberals do a lot of talking. We're pretty hypercritical. We really wanted to be solution-oriented, believing that the most impacted people in our city really have the brilliant solutions to help change that.
Anybody who actually understands how communism and feminism actually work and actually evolved to a very small degree will know that she's a communist. But of course, the dramatic majority of the people who supported her sincerely believe that she's not, which is why she came in 3rd place for mayor and was demanding a recount for a week like a crazy person. Honestly, the sad fact is this. Most people just learned the word intersectionality a year or two ago and have never bothered to learn much of anything about feminism or Marxism. So when somebody told them, it's just feminism that pays attention to everybody's issues, regardless of gender or skin color, it all sounded good. But of course, somebody had to come up with this phrase, intersectional feminism, and those people were taught by other people, and by now, hopefully, you'll see that it's literally just hand-me-down heirlooms from people who were marching in the 70s who directly got it from communist women. Which is pretty obviously why they hate gay men so much, because A, they're feminists and feminists hate men, but B, because they are communists and communists hate gay men a whole bunch if you look at history, because they thought that gay men were a sign of bourgeois capitalism or something like that. I should actually really read exactly what people like Fidel Castro had to say about gay men. I haven't done it yet, but I should. So when somebody tells you, I'm an intersectional feminist, and you say, do you self-identify as a communist? And they say, no. You might want to say, well, maybe you should consider openly identifying as a communist, because it's literally all the same crap, even if you don't know it. And if they don't believe you, you can certainly try showing them this video. And if you valued this video, you can share it with anybody, and you can certainly support my channel to keep me buying books that you should never be forced to read, like Red Feminism and books like Unholy Alliance, which is actually a really awesome read. You can donate to me on PayPal, and I just realized that they have a monthly subscription thing on PayPal, so maybe you can do that. I cannot do this work without support from you guys, and you know how rarely I ask, so if this video proves just how much I'm willing to work to educate anybody interested, basically for free, think about what you can tip me. Links about how you can do that are in the video description and on my channel page. Have yourself a wonderful new year.